It's just kind of who I am. I want to pour into my team as much as possible, and I'm pretty in tune with my body. I can read a room pretty well, and so when I see we're lacking a little bit, you got to step up. But if we're good, you're just there to encourage and give people confidence.
Hello, everyone.
When basketball's most electric young talent made a decision that would ripple through an entire league, nobody expected one of her supposed rivals to be the only voice willing to tell the truth. Caitlin Clark didn't just sign a contract with NBC Universal. She rewrote the rulebook for what a female athlete could become without asking permission from the establishment that supposedly built her. And Sophie Cunningham, the player the media spent months painting as Clark's antagonist, became the only veteran willing to say what everyone was thinking, but nobody dared speak aloud. The timing couldn't have been more calculated or more consequential. While the WNBA's executive offices responded to Clark's announcement with their trademark silence, Cunningham did something far more dangerous. She validated it. Not out of loyalty to a teammate, not out of some manufactured solidarity, but because she recognized a masterclass in leverage that the league's old guard was too threatened to acknowledge. This wasn't just a career move. This was a declaration of independence. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand the system Clark just escaped. Everything you're about to discover reveals how one player's decision to walk away from the WNBA's traditional path didn't just change her life. It exposed the fundamental vulnerabilities in an entire institution. And the shocking part, the person defending that decision most vocally is someone everyone assumed would be celebrating her failure. For decades, professional women's basketball operated under an unspoken but firmly enforced system designed to limit player independence and maintain institutional control. This system wasn't born from malice. It emerged from economic realities and unchallenged assumptions about what female athletes should accept. But when Caitlin Clark arrived in the WNBA, she didn't just play within the system. She began dismantling it. And when she signed with NBC Universal, the foundational structure cracked wide open. The nature of Clark's deal cannot be overstated. NBC didn't sign her for occasional appearances or limited commentary during special events. They committed to a multi-year agreement positioning her as a regular contributor to major broadcasts, Sunday Night Football, Big Ten's Saturday Night. She'll sit alongside legendary male athletes like Carmelo Anthony and Vince Carter as a peer, not a guest. This matters because it's unprecedented. No female basketball player has achieved this level of mainstream sports integration this early in her career. What this actually means is profound. While other WNBA players spend off-seasons grinding in overseas leagues, exhausting their bodies for survival wages in Russia, Turkey, or China, Clark will be building her brand in America's biggest sports moments. She won't risk injury in competitive play. She won't depend on league approval for visibility. She'll command compensation that likely exceeds her WNBA salary while protecting her physical health. Most critically, she'll maintain a platform that operates independent of the WNBA's control structure. The WNBA's institutional power has always depended on a specific asymmetry. Players need the league more than the league needs individual players. The league controls scheduling, narrative, media access, and everything else that generates visibility. If you want an audience, you need their infrastructure. If you want a platform, you need their approval. That dependency creates the leverage that keeps players accepting limited compensation and constrained autonomy. It's a system that works perfectly as long as no player discovers independent leverage. Clark discovered that leverage and immediately exercised it. She didn't negotiate within the system for better terms. She built something outside the system entirely. That's the seismic shift. She proved that a young female athlete can achieve massive platform and financial security without remaining dependent on the WNBA's infrastructure or approval. She created a proof of concept that fundamentally challenges the league's foundational assumptions. The financial implications are staggering. WNBA salaries max out around $250,000 annually. Even elite players with supermax contracts earn substantially less than comparable male athletes. Clark's NBC contract details remain undisclosed publicly, but industry speculation suggests it rivals or exceeds her WNBA salary, offering comparable compensation for work requiring a fraction of the time and physical exertion. The mathematics are brutal. More money, less work, less physical risk. But this isn't really about money, even though the money matters significantly. It's about what money represents: independence. For the first time, a young female basketball player at her sport's peak visibility built a professional platform that doesn't depend on Wnba goodwill. She can criticize league policies without fearing retaliation. The league can't threaten to remove her from their ecosystem because she's not dependent on their ecosystem. She can use her platform to highlight player treatment issues, compensation problems, or institutional failures without worrying about punishment through fines or reduced playing time. That loss of control genuinely terrifies Wnba leadership, though they're expressing it through silence rather than acknowledgement. When your entire institutional structure assumes player dependency, discovering that a major star found viable alternatives is destabilizing. It raises questions for every other player. Could I do something similar? Should I be exploring options outside the league? If Clark negotiated this kind of deal, what am I settling for by remaining fully dependent on the Wnba? The Wnba's response has been calculated silence. No congratulations. No celebration of having a Wnba player on major broadcasts. The obvious public relations move if they actually believed their institution was secure. Instead, complete silence. That silence is itself revealing. It's the silence of an institution recognizing its lost leverage and struggling to figure out how to maintain control without admitting that leverage is gone. Sophie Cunningham saw through that silence immediately. She understood what was really happening, not just that Clark made a smart career move, but that Clark fundamentally altered power dynamics within the entire league. Instead of joining the resentment choir, Cunningham validated it. She looked at what Clark accomplished and recognized it as exactly what an intelligent athlete should do when given the opportunity. This sets up everything that follows, because the real story isn't whether Clark's move was right or wrong. It's about an institution built on control meeting resistance from within its own ranks. The Wnba has an unspoken but rigorously enforced code among its players. Don't publicly criticize the league, don't air internal disputes on social media, and absolutely don't validate moves that go against what the establishment wants. This code isn't enforced through explicit rules or official punishments. It's maintained through social pressure, through understanding that stepping out of line results in ostracism, through the implicit threat that your career becomes significantly harder if you're seen as disloyal to the sisterhood narrative. For years, players maintained this silence even when they disagreed with league decisions, even when they felt treated unfairly, even when they observed hypocrisy at the institutional level. Sophie Cunningham broke that code in a way that sent genuine shockwaves through the league. The power of her break wasn't in hostility or aggression. It was in simple refusal to participate in the narrative the league's establishment wanted her to embrace. When Caitlin Clark's NBC deal was announced, there was an immediate expectation that players would respond with either silence or resentment. The script was already written. Veteran players would feel threatened by a young star getting mainstream attention. Jealousy would drive criticism. The narrative would become about generational conflict and wounded pride. That story would have served the league's interests because it would have positioned Clark's move as divisive rather than revolutionary. Cunningham walked into that narrative and refused to cooperate. Her response wasn't cautious or measured. It was validation. She essentially told the basketball world that she understood what Clark had accomplished and respected the decision-making that led there. More importantly, she articulated something that institutional leadership desperately didn't want articulated, that Clark's success outside the league's control structure actually benefited everyone, not just Clark herself. Understanding Cunningham's background is crucial for understanding her response. She's not a naive young player who doesn't understand league politics. She's a veteran who has navigated Wnba system complexities for years. She's dealt with officiating controversies, questionable fines, scheduling decisions that seemed arbitrary, and all the accumulated frustrations of being in a league where power flows in one direction. She's been around long enough to understand how institutional power operates, how narratives get constructed to serve institutional interests, and how players are expected to self-police their speech to maintain institutional cohesion. She's also experienced enough to recognize when someone else is recognizing the same things she does. When Clark walked away from the unrivaled league's massive offers and chose the path that served her interests rather than institutional interests, Cunningham immediately saw that as an act of clarity. Clark wasn't being ungrateful or disloyal. She was being rational. She was recognizing that the system asking her to sacrifice for the collective wasn't necessarily acting in her best interests, and she was choosing to act in her own interests instead. That's not betrayal, that's business maturity. What makes Cunningham's position even more significant is the opportunities she had to take a different path. She could have made cryptic social media posts about loyalty and sisterhood. She could have participated in whisper campaigns criticizing Clark's decision. She could have given interviews expressing disappointment that Clark wasn't supporting the league's off-season initiatives. The path of institutional loyalty was clearly marked, socially rewarded, and available. Players who stayed silent or expressed appropriate disapproval would be viewed as team players. Instead, Cunningham chose to speak up in support of a decision that goes directly against what league leadership wants players to support. This reveals something fundamental about Cunningham's character that doesn't fit the media's antagonist narrative. She's not seeking approval from institutional leadership. She's not interested in playing the role she was cast in. She has her own independent analysis of what's happening, and she's willing to voice that analysis publicly, even knowing it will be interpreted as going against the grain. That's genuine courage in an environment where most players carefully manage public statements to avoid institutional consequences. Breaking silence is particularly powerful because Cunningham has institutional standing. She's not a young player who can be dismissed as naive or uninformed. She's a veteran with respect within the league. She's been part of player leadership structures. When she says Clark made the right call, she's saying it from a position of authority and understanding. The institutional establishment can't easily dismiss her as jealous or naive. They have to actually engage with what she's saying rather than dismiss it. By breaking silence, Cunningham forced other players to confront their own positions. If one respected veteran publicly supports Clark's move, then other players face a choice. Do they join her or remain silent? And if they remain silent, is it because they genuinely disagree with Cunningham and Clark, or because they're afraid of institutional consequences? That's a much more complicated position than the simple narrative of resentful veterans that the league preferred. There has always been a specific script for how female basketball players navigate their professional careers. This script is ancient in its origins and remarkably consistent in execution. You grow up loving basketball. You excel in high school and college. You get drafted by a WNBA team. Then you accept the financial reality of women's professional sports. The WNBA salary, while legitimate, doesn't generate enough income to sustain a lifestyle or build wealth. So you play the summer season, collect your paycheck, and every autumn you make the same familiar journey to Russia, Turkey, China, or another country where your services are valued at compensation levels that make the expense and time away worthwhile. This isn't presented as a limitation. It's presented as the natural order of professional women's basketball. You're supposed to feel fortunate to play professionally at all. You're supposed to feel grateful for the opportunity to compete at the highest level. You're supposed to be willing to sacrifice personal convenience and bodily health for the privilege of doing what you love. The overseas leagues aren't optional. They're fundamental to survival as a professional female athlete. Your body gets battered by a competitive WNBA season. Then immediately you board flights to play in unfamiliar leagues with different coaching styles and significantly less regulation around player safety. By the time you return to the next WNBA season, you're exhausted and injured before you even begin. More recently, the league created an alternative to the overseas grind, the Unrivaled League, an off-season competition positioned as a premium alternative to playing abroad. Instead of flying to Russia or China, elite players could stay stateside and compete in Miami with better facilities and coaching. It was presented as progress, as women's basketball infrastructure evolution. but it required the same fundamental sacrifice: time away from recovery, physical exertion during the off-season, injury risk, and most critically, dependency on a structure controlled by league leadership and players' association leadership. The script that emerged was unambiguous and unquestioned. You play in the WNBA because it's the pinnacle of women's professional basketball. You accept whatever salary the league offers because limited alternatives exist. You play in the off-season because WNBA compensation isn't enough to sustain you. You accept that your body will be exhausted and compromised because that's the price of professional basketball. You remain grateful and appreciative because complaining suggests ingratitude. You don't explore outside opportunities because that suggests disloyalty. You stay in the system because the system has defined itself as the only legitimate path. This script produced generations of players who accepted these terms because they genuinely didn't believe alternatives existed. They internalized the idea that this was just how women's basketball worked. They saw players who came before them follow the same pattern and assumed it was inevitable. They were told that complaining about salary or working conditions would result in being labeled difficult or ungrateful. So they stayed silent. The system perpetuated itself through precedent, weight, and fear of being the person who broke the pattern. Caitlin Clark looked at that script and asked one simple question: why? She didn't ask with antagonism or disrespect. She asked it as someone who genuinely couldn't see logical reasons why she should accept the terms of a system that didn't serve her interests. She was a generational talent, the kind of player who comes along once in a decade, if that. She had leverage that most players never develop. She had visibility and marketability that translated into value outside the WNBA ecosystem. So she explored what that value could actually generate. What she discovered was that organizations outside the WNBA were willing to pay substantially for her presence and platform. NBC Universal saw value in having her as an analyst. Other corporations saw value in sponsorships and endorsements. The market, when she engaged it directly, had a very different valuation of her worth than the WNBA's salary structure reflected. That realization didn't make her ungrateful for the WNBA opportunity. It simply meant she could see that the WNBA was undervaluing her compared to what the broader market would pay. So she built an alternative path. She maintained her WNBA status as a player, but supplemented that role with platform and visibility that gave her income independence and professional diversification. She didn't have to choose between professional basketball and financial security. She could do both simultaneously. And in doing that, she fundamentally challenged the script. The script said you must pick one path. You're a WNBA player first and foremost. Clark's path said you can be a WNBA player and also be a media personality, and also be a brand, and also be building influence that operates independent of the league's control. The script said you must accept whatever the league offers because real alternatives don't exist. Clark's path said you can actively create alternatives and negotiate from a position of genuine choice rather than desperation. When the WNBA's institutional leadership saw Clark reject the script, their response was silence. They couldn't celebrate her success because her success was explicitly built on moving outside their control structure. They couldn't criticize her directly because that would invite questions about why they should have better business terms if they're supposedly building a league benefiting its players. They couldn't offer her special deals because that would set precedent for other players to do exactly what Clark did: develop leverage outside the league and demand better terms. To understand why Sophie Cunningham's response to Caitlin Clark's NBC deal carries such weight, you need to understand the pressure campaign that preceded it. This wasn't a casual offer that the unrivaled league extended to Clark. This was a coordinated, intensive campaign designed to convince her that joining was not just a good business decision, but a moral imperative, a matter of supporting her sisterhood, elevating the sport, and standing in solidarity with union leadership, betting everything on her participation. The Unrivaled League was created by Brianna Stewart and Nafi Saker, two of the biggest stars in women's basketball and prominent leaders within the WNBA Players Association. It wasn't a grassroots initiative from outside the league. It was built by insiders, controlled by players with significant institutional authority. The concept was to create a premium off-season competition that would keep elite players in the United States, eliminate the need for overseas play, and generate revenue that would theoretically benefit league players through profit sharing and investment returns. On the surface, this sounds aligned with player interests, but the structure created something more complicated, a situation where people running the Players Association were also running a competing league and actively recruiting WNBA players to participate. That creates an inherent conflict of interest. How can people simultaneously advocate for players' individual rights within the WNBA, while also running a separate entity competing for those same players' time, energy, and participation? The campaign to bring Clark into the unrivaled structure was extraordinarily aggressive and extraordinarily well-funded. Reports suggest they offered her over $1 million in league shares, actual ownership stakes, along with contract structures modeled after elite soccer contracts like Lionel Messi's Miami deal. Financially, it was an impressive offer. But the financial offer was only one pressure layer. Behind the scenes, there was a narrative campaign that was equally potent and arguably more important. The narrative being circulated was that Clark had a responsibility to use her platform and visibility to elevate women's basketball. The implication was clear. If she cared about the sport and supporting other women, she would commit to unrivaled. The language of sisterhood and collective action was deployed heavily. Other players, particularly veterans with institutional authority, were positioned to deliver the message that Clark would be letting her peers down by not joining. It's important to recognize what this pressure campaign actually was, an attempt to use Clark's own values against her. She cares about basketball. She cares about elevating women's sports. She cares about her peers and their well-being. The pressure campaign framed joining unrivaled as the expression of those values. Refusing to join became reframed as selfishness, as unwillingness to sacrifice for the collective, as prioritizing personal gain over sisterhood. This kind of pressure is coercion in the psychological and social sense, even if not in the legal sense. It was using institutional authority, moral language, and peer pressure to push someone toward a decision that served the leadership's interests even if it might not serve the individual's interests. What makes this insidious is how it was clothed in female solidarity language. If you frame a financial investment as an act of sisterhood, you make it much harder for someone to refuse without appearing to reject sisterhood itself. If you get players with institutional authority to deliver the message, you make it seem like peer consensus rather than top-down pressure. Clark's decision to refuse this offer wasn't casual. She understood that she was going against the wishes of some of the most powerful figures in women's basketball. She understood that refusing would likely result in some players feeling personally rejected, in institutional relationships being strained, in the possibility of social consequences within the league. And she did it anyway. That's what makes her move genuinely courageous. It wasn't a decision made in isolation or from a position of institutional strength. It was a decision made against significant pressure from people with real power in her sport. And she made it because the offer didn't serve her interests, regardless of how it was framed in terms of collective benefit. Sophie Cunningham saw that pressure campaign happening in real time. She was positioned within the same institutional circles where this messaging was being deployed. She likely heard the same arguments about Clark having a responsibility to support women's basketball. She likely heard suggestions that Clark's refusal was selfish or disloyal. And instead of accepting those arguments, Cunningham recognized them as exactly what they were: pressure tactics designed to serve the leadership's interests, not Clark's interests. What Cunningham understood, and what she made clear in her response, is that Clark's decision to refuse this pressure wasn't a betrayal of women's basketball. It was a demonstration of exactly the kind of independent thinking and strength that women's sports actually need. It was a player recognizing her own value, understanding that the offer being made didn't match that value, and having the courage to walk away from institutional pressure to pursue what actually served her interests. To understand why Sophie Cunningham responded to Caitlin Clark's NBC deal with validation instead of resentment, You need to understand something fundamental about who Sophie Cunningham is as a person and as a player. The media spent months constructing her as Clark's antagonist, the enforcer, the jealous veteran, the player threatened by a young star's arrival. That narrative required believing that Cunningham was motivated by resentment and competition, that she saw Clark as a threat to her own status and wanted to tear her down. But that analysis fundamentally misunderstood Cunningham's character and her actual values. Cunningham is a veteran who has dealt with the Wnba system for years, and that experience has given her clarity about how institutional power operates and where individual players should position themselves strategically. She's not a bitter veteran angry that younger players are getting attention. She's someone who has shown genuine respect for raw talent throughout her career. When she publicly acknowledged that Caitlin Clark was the reason the Wnba transitioned to chartered flights, when other veterans were either complaining or remaining silent, she was demonstrating a commitment to giving credit where it was due regardless of personal rivalry. That comment about charter flights is actually key to understanding Cunningham's entire approach to the Clark situation. She looked at a situation where the league was benefiting enormously from Clark's star power, where players were enjoying improved conditions because of Clark's presence, and where many people were either refusing to acknowledge this reality or actively taking it for granted. And she said it aloud. She didn't soften the statement or make it conditional on other factors. She just stated the fact, Clark made this happen. That's not the behavior of someone motivated by resentment. That's the behavior of someone motivated by clarity and honesty. Cunningham values truth-telling, and she was willing to tell a truth that didn't serve her own interests or the interests of people she was aligned with. She was willing to do it because the truth mattered more to her than institutional loyalty or personal advantage. So when the NBC deal was announced, Cunningham's response was entirely consistent with who she is. She looked at what Clark had accomplished, and she recognized it as shrewd, as intelligent, as the kind of strategic decision-making that deserves respect. She wasn't thinking, I'm jealous that Clark is getting this opportunity. She was thinking, Clark just demonstrated something important about how players can build leverage. And being someone who values leverage, independence, and the ability to resist institutional control, she couldn't help but respect that demonstration. There's also something important about Cunningham's business sophistication. Off the court, she's one of the sharpest business minds in the Wnba. She understands contracts, financial structures, strategic positioning. When she looks at what Clark negotiated with NBC, she's not just seeing a player getting a nice offer. She's seeing someone who understood the market value of her platform and successfully extracted that value from the market. That's something a sophisticated businessperson recognizes and respects, particularly when you come from a background where players were traditionally told to accept whatever they were offered because alternatives didn't exist. Cunningham also understands something else that drives her response, the rising tide principle. She's been in the league long enough to understand that when one player generates massive value and visibility, that visibility eventually lifts the entire league. When more eyes are on women's basketball, when the game gets more mainstream attention, when players become more recognized and valued in broader culture, that benefits every player in the league. Better TV deals, better sponsorship opportunities, better league profile, more investment in women's sports generally. So when other players expressed resentment that Clark wouldn't join Unrivaled, that she was choosing to prioritize her own interests over the league's interests, Cunningham was thinking several moves ahead. She was recognizing that Clark's success on NBC would actually increase the league's profile and value. She was understanding that having a star WNBA player in mainstream sports media would legitimize women's basketball in ways that purely league-controlled initiatives couldn't accomplish. And she was intelligent enough to articulate that perspective publicly, essentially saying to her peers, instead of being jealous, recognize that this lift benefits us too. That perspective reveals something crucial about Cunningham's actual motivation. She's not defending Clark out of personal friendship. She's not motivated by loyalty to someone who's also a competitor on the court. She's motivated by a recognition that Clark's move represents a blueprint that other players should be studying. She's motivated by respect for independent thinking and strategic self-interest. She's motivated by the simple economics of the situation. The league benefits when its stars are visible and valuable, regardless of where that visibility comes from. This is why her response is so dangerous to the institutional establishment. If Cunningham had responded with resentment, if she had played the role the media wanted her to play, she would have been reinforcing the narrative that the league wanted pushed. That Clark's move was divisive, that it created tension among players, that it represented a betrayal of the sisterhood. Instead, by validating the move and explaining the logic behind it, she's essentially telling other players that there's a rational way to think about this situation beyond institutional loyalty. At the heart of Sophie Cunningham's frustration with the response to Caitlin Clark's NBC deal is a hypocrisy so obvious that it becomes almost comical once you're actually looking at it directly. The WNBA leadership and many veteran players have built their entire argument around the idea that Caitlin Clark has a responsibility to support women's basketball, to use her platform for the collective good, to understand that her success creates obligations to lift others in the sport. They've framed her refusal to join unrivaled as selfish, as a betrayal of sisterhood, as a failure to live up to what her talent and visibility demand she contribute. But here's the hypocrisy that Cunningham is pointing out. The same people delivering this message about collective responsibility are simultaneously resentful that Clark is being successful in ways that don't require their approval or their institutional control. They want Clark to sacrifice for the league while refusing to sacrifice anything for her. They want her to prioritize their interests while they actively protect their own institutional power. They want her to see her success as belonging to the collective while they personally benefit from that success and offer nothing in return except access to the same system that has always constrained female athletes. Look at the actual mechanics of what's happening. Caitlin Clark enters the WNBA as a rookie and immediately generates unprecedented attention. Games sell out. Television ratings spike. Sponsorship interest increases. The league gets charter flights. Media companies want to cover the sport in new ways. Players benefit from better facilities and working conditions. The entire ecosystem of women's basketball expands because Clark's presence expanded it. But despite generating all of this value, Clark is told that she should be grateful for the salary she's offered, that she should commit to playing in off-season leagues that serve the leadership's interests, that she should understand that her value belongs to the collective rather than to herself. Then, when Clark finds a way to extract actual market value for that visibility and talent, when she signs with NBC for compensation that likely exceeds what the league was paying her, the response from leadership is resentment. But here's where the hypocrisy becomes crystal clear. The league was perfectly happy to benefit from Clark's value. The league took her star power, used it to generate revenue, improved their infrastructure using the money her presence created, and offered her standard compensation in return. When she tried to get paid what she's actually worth, suddenly she's the disloyal one. Suddenly she's the problem. Cunningham immediately recognized this contradiction. She watched a league that had benefited enormously from Clark's presence express resentment that Clark was also benefiting from her own presence. She watched the leadership respond with silence instead of celebration. And she understood that this silence was born from fear. Fear that Clark had demonstrated the possibility of player independence. Fear that other young players might follow her example. Fear that the traditional power structure was being disrupted. What Cunningham called out, essentially, was the fact that the league wanted to have it both ways. They wanted access to Clark's value, benefit from her presence, leverage her talent for their own institutional purposes. But they didn't want to pay her what she was worth. They didn't want to cede control over her platform or her choices. They wanted her to remain dependent on them while they remained free to use her as they saw fit. That's not sisterhood. That's extraction masquerading as collective action. The unrivaled league situation is where the hypocrisy becomes most visible. The league's leadership created an off-season competition and then actively recruited Clark to join it. They positioned participation as an act of supporting women's basketball, as lifting the sport, as being part of something revolutionary. But the subtext was clear. They wanted her participation because it would validate their league, attract investment, guarantee TV deals, and ensure profitability. They weren't asking her to sacrifice for altruistic reasons. They were asking her to sacrifice because it served their financial interests. When Clarke declined and chose the NBC path instead, the response from those same people was anger masquerading as disappointment. They claimed she was being ungrateful. They suggested she wasn't supporting the league. They positioned her choice as selfish. But what they were really angry about was that she had refused to serve their interests when serving those interests wouldn't have served her interests. She looked at their offer, evaluated it against her actual needs and value, and chose something better. And that choice was unforgivable to people accustomed to having their interests prioritized by the players they hold power over. Cunningham watched all of this happen and recognized it as exactly the kind of dynamic that has constrained women's sports for generations. Leadership extracts value from players while telling them they should be grateful for the opportunity. Leadership creates systems that benefit from player talent while offering minimal compensation in return. Leadership then expresses resentment when players try to access market value for that same talent. It's a system designed to maximize institutional power and minimize player autonomy. Hypocrisy extends to how the league has treated Clarke's presence generally. They've benefited enormously from her arrival. Their attendance is up, their television ratings are stronger, their cultural relevance has increased dramatically. Media companies want to cover the WNBA in new ways because of Clarke's presence. International interest in women's basketball has grown. The entire ecosystem of women's sports has been elevated by her existence in the league. Yet when she tries to extract value from that same presence by pursuing outside opportunities, she's treated as disloyal. Cunningham's response to this hypocrisy is essentially to say, "This is ridiculous. If Clarke's talent and presence are valuable enough to transform the entire league, then Clarke should be compensated according to that value." There's a moment that institutional leaders dread, though they rarely acknowledge it directly. The moment when someone they've built their power structure around achieves independence and realizes they no longer need the institution's approval. That's the moment when the balance of power shifts irreversibly. And that's exactly what happened when Caitlin Clarke signed with NBC Universal. For the WNBA, power has always flowed from control of access. The league controls when games are played, where they're played, what coverage is available, how narratives are framed. If a player wants a platform, wants visibility, wants to build their brand, they need the league's cooperation. The league controls the broadcasting rights. The league controls the official communications channels. If you want millions of people to see you play, you need the WNBA's infrastructure and the WNBA's approval. That dependency is what gives the league institutional power over individual players. Caitlin Clarke just moved around that entire power structure. She built a platform with NBC that potentially exceeds the WNBA's own platform in terms of reach and audience size. Sunday Night Football, one of America's most watched television programs, now features her as an analyst. Millions of people who have never watched the WNBA or cared about women's basketball are now encountering Clarke's perspective on sports. She's building an audience that's independent of the WNBA's infrastructure. She's creating a platform that doesn't depend on the league's goodwill or cooperation. That shift in power dynamic is genuinely threatening to the league's leadership, and it's important to understand why. The traditional model of institutional power in sports relies on scarcity. There's only one NBA. There's only one WNBA. If you want to be part of the pinnacle of professional basketball, you need the league's permission. That scarcity gives the league enormous leverage. Players compete for the limited slots available. They accept the terms offered because the alternative is not playing professionally. The league holds the scarce resource, so the league holds the power. But Clarke's NBC deal introduces a new kind of resource, mainstream media platform that operates independently of the WNBA. Suddenly, a player has access to a megaphone that doesn't require the league's permission. Suddenly, a player can reach millions of viewers without being dependent on the league's broadcasting infrastructure. That changes everything about the power dynamic. Consider what Clarke's NBC platform actually means in practical terms. If there's a policy decision the WNBA makes that Clark disagrees with, regarding player treatment, compensation structures, officiating standards, anything, she now has a platform where she can discuss that publicly. When she appears on Sunday Night Football, she's speaking to an audience of millions. She could raise WNBA issues directly on that platform. She could draw attention to inequities or problems within the league. And the league would have almost no ability to prevent her from doing so. They can't fire her from NBC. They can't revoke her broadcasting access. She's part of the league as a player, but her platform is external to their control. That's why the league's silence about Clark's NBC deal is so revealing. If the league were actually confident about their position, they would be celebrating. They would be making statements about how proud they are to have a WNBA player in mainstream sports media. They would be positioning it as validation of their league's quality and visibility. Instead, they said nothing. The silence is the silence of an institution recognizing that it's lost leverage and trying to figure out how to maintain power from a weakened position. The shift in power becomes even more significant when you consider what it means for other players moving forward. Young players are watching what Clark accomplished. They're seeing that it's possible to build independent platforms. They're recognizing that the WNBA is not the only path to visibility and value. If Clark can do it, the implication goes, then theoretically any player with talent and visibility could attempt similar strategies. That means the WNBA's leverage is no longer absolute. It's now contingent on offering players terms that are better than the alternatives they could pursue independently. This is genuinely destabilizing for an institution built on scarcity and control. The WNBA suddenly can't just offer a salary and expect players to accept it gratefully. The WNBA has to compete now. They have to offer terms that are actually appealing compared to what players could get by pursuing independent platforms. That's a significant shift in negotiating dynamics. Sophie Cunningham recognizes all of this because she's someone who has always valued independence and autonomy. She understands what it means to have leverage and how that changes the power dynamic. So when she validates Clark's move, she's not just saying, "Good career choice." She's signaling to the entire league, the era of institutional control is transitioning. Players are becoming more sophisticated about their own value. Players are building independent platforms. The old power structure is being disrupted, and the only way forward is acknowledging player value fairly rather than attempting to extract that value while maintaining institutional control. When you watch Sophie Cunningham talk about Caitlin Clark's NBC choice, what you're witnessing is something that gets described in sports culture as game recognizes game. The mutual respect that emerges when two competitive people recognize excellence and strategic thinking in each other, regardless of rivalry or institutional positioning. It's a phrase typically used to describe moments when competitors acknowledge each other's quality and approach. But in this case, it means something even deeper than standard sportsmanship. Cunningham isn't respecting Clark because they're friends or because they're on the same side of some institutional conflict. She's respecting Clark because Clark demonstrated exactly the kind of independent thinking, strategic clarity, and willingness to prioritize personal interests over institutional pressure that Cunningham herself values. These are competitive instincts applied to business and leverage rather than to basketball itself. They're the same instincts that make Cunningham a tough competitor on the court, just deployed in a different arena. They're the same commitment to clarity and strategic thinking that has defined her approach to navigating professional basketball. What's particularly significant is that Cunningham could have easily played the antagonist role that the media wanted her to play. The narrative was already written. Younger viewers expect older players to resent younger talent. Media outlets profit from conflict between generations. The established power structure benefits from players being divided against each other. If Cunningham had expressed disappointment in Clark's choice, if she had suggested that Clark wasn't supporting the league, if she had joined the resentment chorus, she would have been rewarded with more media attention, more cultural positioning, more institutional approval. Instead, she did something much harder. She refused the role. She called out the hypocrisy. She validated a decision that goes against what the league's leadership wanted. and she did it knowing that this position wouldn't make her popular with institutional leadership. It was a choice to prioritize truth-telling over personal advantage. That's what game actually looks like. That's what respect actually means in competitive culture. Not manufactured support, but genuine recognition of intelligence and strategic excellence. The specific moment that crystallized Cunningham's respect for Clark was probably the charter flight situation. When the league was being criticized for commercial flights and fans were angry about the working conditions, Cunningham could have stayed silent. She could have distanced herself from the issue. Instead, she publicly credited Clark as the reason the league was able to upgrade to charter flights. That wasn't a small gesture. That was a veteran with institutional standing, saying out loud that Clark had generated the value that improved conditions for everyone. That moment reveals something fundamental about how Cunningham actually operates. She's not someone whose thinking is constrained by institutional loyalty or team politics. She's willing to tell the truth about who created value and who should get credit for that value creation. That's the kind of integrity that's necessary for recognizing game when you see it. You can't acknowledge excellence if you're committed to protecting institutional narratives that deny that excellence. So when the NBC deal dropped, Cunningham's response was entirely consistent with who she is. She looked at what Clark had accomplished, and she saw a player who had done exactly what Cunningham would have done in the same position. She recognized her own value, she found a market willing to compensate that value, and she took that opportunity. That's not disloyal. That's intelligent. That's exactly what a competitive person with strategic clarity would do. The phrase "game recognizes game" also carries implications about mutual understanding. When Cunningham validates Clark's move, she's not just saying, "I respect your choice." She's saying, "I understand what you did and why you did it, and I recognize the intelligence and courage that move required." She's signaling a kind of kinship based on shared values and similar approaches to navigating a competitive landscape. They approach basketball differently on the court, Clark with technical perfection, Cunningham with physical intensity. But off the court, they approach power and leverage similarly. Both are willing to challenge authority, both value independence, both are strategic about their own interests. Cunningham is also modeling something important for younger players. She's demonstrating that it's possible to be a tough competitor on the court and a rational thinker off the court. You don't have to hate your opponents. You don't have to resent other players' success. You can compete fiercely while simultaneously recognizing excellence and respecting strategic decision-making. That's maturity. That's the kind of approach that builds respect across competing interests. What Cunningham is essentially telling the entire league is, game will recognize game. Clark made a smart move. I recognize it as smart. You should recognize it as smart too. Stop being resentful and start paying attention to what you can learn from this situation. That's the message running underneath all of Cunningham's public comments about Clark's move. The significance of this cannot be overstated. The WNBA has built a lot of its identity around solidarity and collective action. That's actually valuable. But solidarity can also become constraining if it suppresses individual player autonomy or protects institutional interests at the expense of player interests. The drama unfolding in women's basketball isn't really about conflict between Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham. It's about an institution struggling to maintain control when one of its stars discovers leverage and exercises it. It's about a player recognizing her own value and refusing to accept less. It's about an emerging culture where women athletes understand they don't have to remain dependent on systems designed to constrain them. Sophie Cunningham's voice in this situation will likely be remembered as the moment when the balance of power in women's basketball began to shift. Not because she's the most talented player or the biggest star, but because she was willing to tell the truth when institutional pressure demanded silence. She recognized that Clark's move represented something revolutionary, not just an individual success, but a template for player independence that threatens the traditional power structure. The WNBA has two paths forward. They can listen to what Cunningham is actually saying, acknowledge the reality of player value, and begin offering terms that reflect that value. Or they can continue with resentful silence, hoping that the situation resolves itself while secretly fearing that more players will follow Clark's example. What's clear is that women's basketball will never be the same. And Sophie Cunningham just made sure everyone understood why.